The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts. On January 10, 1861, Florida seceded from the Union, becoming the third state to do so after only South Carolina and Mississippi. Like other southern states, Florida wanted to preserve the institution of slavery to protect their plantation-based economic system. With the end of the Civil War in 1865, slavery was abolished, marking the beginning of the end for Florida's plantation society. Remnants of Florida's plantation culture can still be seen today. Some plantations in Florida, like the Elliott Plantation, date to the British period, which lasted from 1763 to 1783. Others, including the Kingsley Plantation, were built during the Second Spanish period in the late 1700s. It was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 that led to Florida becoming a United States territory in 1821, and after that, the plantation culture in Florida flourished. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. Plantations in Florida were part of an agrarian-based society that depended upon the labor of enslaved people.
Antebellum life in Florida from, let's say, 1821 to the Civil War, or 1865, consisted of the production of cotton. That was the main economy of scales for those involved in farming on their plantations and farms. And the people who did most of the work were enslaved laborers. When you think about the state of Florida in 1865, 45% of the inhabitants in 1865 were enslaved workers. So enslaved workers played a dynamic role in the growth of Florida. I look at Florida as two Floridas: Florida before the Civil War and Florida after the Civil War.
Antebellum life in Florida was incredibly difficult. Remember, the people had to generally grow their own food. There were no processed foods or places that you could buy things. There were in some of the towns in Antebellum, Florida, like Tallahassee or Noonanville, Florida, in East Florida, there would have been dry goods stores probably by the late 1830s, 1840s. But other than that, the settlers had to basically grow their own food. They had livestock, of course, that they could rely on, but travel was very difficult. So a lot of those items, a lot of foodstuffs and other necessary items for daily life were difficult to obtain.
In 1830, 90% of the cotton grown in then the territory of Florida was grown in Middle Florida. Middle Florida consisted of Gaston County, Leon County, Madison County, Hamilton County, and maybe a few other counties. But when you looked at the production, the county that produced more than these other counties was Leon County.
In Middle Florida, which was where most of the concentrated settlement was and where most of the early immigration into the territory came, the people that came there, not all the people that came there, but many of the people that came there came from very well-to-do backgrounds in Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, primarily Virginia and Maryland at first. And they came to buy land, buy some of the best land that was left available east of the Mississippi, really, and take their civilizations, their agricultural civilization, their economic civilization, and their social civilization, and kind of replant it in these red hills. And it was a very exciting time. There was a lot of newcomers with cash, with resources, with connections from the outside world, with political connections. And so that was where the incredible economic growth came.
In Middle Florida, you had over 1,500 plantations with 500 acres or more. You had smaller units, and you had something like 2,500 farms with 500 acres or less. So you had most of the people focusing on growing primarily one staple crop, and that was cotton. So there were many plantations and farms, and along with that, you had enslaved workers working on both plantations and farms.
The Thomas Brown family, he was an individual from the Richmond area, and he brought about almost 200 slaves with him, literally with the family. They caravanned down from the Richmond area and came into territorial Florida around 1828. So he had known William Pope Duval, who was territorial governor, and so that was a really good example of some of the very well-to-do people. There's a wonderful article about that trek called Virginia Cavalcade, and so this was an incredibly big operation, moving a family and also enslaved people, lock, stock, and barrel, from Virginia all the way through the Carolinas into Georgia, and then finally making it here.
In Leon County alone, 70% of your planters were those who owned 500 acres or more, or over 20 enslaved people. So Tallahassee, Leon County became the center of the cotton kingdom in Florida. When you think about the legislature, when you think about later during the statehood period, the senators, most of them came from the Middle Florida, Leon County area. I mean, everything was centered around the production of cotton. Judges were sometimes owners of enslaved people, large. I think of Judge Jonathan Robinson. He owned over 79 slaves by 1865. He was a judge.
There were other families with lots of political connections and economic capital that came here. For example, William Wirt, who was Attorney General of the United States. He brought his enslaved people, and he had lots and lots of son-in-laws. He had a lot of daughters, and they all married individuals and men who basically came to Florida to kind of win their fortune.
Richard Keith Call built his plantation and home in Leon County. Call served as the third territorial governor of Florida from 1836 to 1839 and the fifth territorial governor of Florida from 1841 to 1844. Call was a protege of Andrew Jackson. When Florida was named a state in 1845, Call ran for President of the United States but lost to William Dunn Mosley. Even though Call owned slaves, he was loyal to the Union and argued against the secession of Florida in 1861.
One of the important things about telling the story of the Grove Museum is also, here at the Grove Museum, is also telling the history and the story of the enslaved peoples that lived here on the property, that helped, that constructed the house behind me, that even made the bricks that you see in the house. The enslaved peoples that worked on the plantation, that contributed to the wealth of Richard Keith Call. So it's important that we tell that story as well, that it does not get lost to history.
Richard Keith Call's primary economic operation was, of course, on Lake Jackson, and he had thousands of acres out there. And we know that he lived in town. When he was in town, he lived in the Grove, but then, of course, primarily when he was out of politics, particularly, he spent almost all of his time out north of town in Lake Jackson.
Leroy Collins, the 33rd governor of Florida, also lived in what is now the Grove Museum. In 1932, Collins married Mary Call Darby, great-granddaughter of Richard Keith Call. Collins served as governor of Florida from 1955 to 1961. Although he was politically moderate, Collins is remembered for advancing civil rights in Florida.
So one of the unique things, one of the interesting things about the Grove Museum is it sees a transition from a time period where people are enslaved and being forced to do labor to when Governor Collins lives here, his efforts in the civil rights movement, and so you get the span of the history between those two different aspects.
And the Grove itself is it's very uncanny in that it's almost identical to the place that Richard Keith Call went often. In fact, he was married there, and that is the Hermitage, which was Andrew Jackson's plantation in Nashville. So he was, I think, kind of determined to create a kind of carbon copy of that here in Florida. And again, very early, one of the first substantial structures in the community, that is residences in the community. And of course, it's still there today, right next to the governor's mansion.
Goodwood Museum and Gardens was established as a historic plantation in the 1830s, late 1830s in territorial Florida. It was established by a man from North Carolina. And of course, the property was built and thrived on slave labor. It was a corn and cotton plantation in the early years. And through time, it was owned by 5 different families. Each time that the property was sold, a lot of the possessions were sold with it. And so the main house, which is a historic house museum today, has a lot of the collections from the original families.
And it was actually founded by Hardy, the Croom brothers, who were really, really amazing characters. They were agriculturalists. They were, you could almost say, scientists as well. And they came to Middle Florida in a very early period from North Carolina. And the Goodwood Plantation actually had probably about 8,000 acres to it. And of course, Goodwood is within the city limits of Tallahassee today. It's right next to the huge hospital, and it's right in the city limits. So it's a place that has a lot of residents.
The second family that owned the plantation purchased it just before the Civil War. They came from the north, and the man Arva Hopkins, was a merchant in town as well as a plantation owner. He was heavily invested in the Confederacy, and after the Civil War, lost his shirt economically, essentially. And so, especially after he passed away, the family began to sell off possessions and land.
So after the war, the two things were clear. One is that in the immediate post-war era, cotton was pretty high. The price of cotton was pretty high, but by 5 or 6 years, the price of cotton went through the cellar. It was totally, a fourth or fifth of what cotton was paying for before. And even though the South, like Florida, like other southern states, experimented with various methods of labor to produce cotton, it really never paid the kind of, it was not as efficient. Frankly, slavery, unfortunately, was efficient as a capitalist institution. And it really never recovered from that. So even though cotton remained the predominant crop really up until the 1880s or 90s, the payout for cotton and the lucrative nature of cotton was simply gone.
Some plantations in Florida survived for a while after the Civil War by using convict labor to replace enslaved people as workers.
Being a convict lease worker was more dangerous, more abusive than enslaved workers. Why do I say this? Well, simply because enslaved workers were valuable. They cost sometimes the master $1,000, $1,500. So you wouldn't try to kill your enslaved workers because they were, above all, if anything, property and an investment. But a convict lease person was only leased for a specific period of time. So you tried to work the hell out of them while you had them, and if they happened to get sick, you still worked them. If they died, you didn't lose very much. But enslaved people, they were more valuable. So really, the convict lease system was a worse system than enslavement.
With the end of slavery after the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, most plantations in Florida could no longer function without their captive labor force. Other plantations, including the Bulow Plantation, were destroyed earlier during the Second Seminole War of the 1830s. The Bulow Plantation was located in what is now Flagler County. The ruins of the Bulow Plantation are preserved in an historic state park. In 1816, Joseph Hernandez was given a Spanish land grant to establish the Mala Compra Plantation. Mala Compra means bad purchase in Spanish. Although others had not been successful on the land, Hernandez was. When Florida became a United States territory in 1821, Hernandez was the first Spanish representative in the U.S. Congress and helped to have Tallahassee named the state capital. The Mala Compra Plantation ruins were first excavated by archaeologists in 1999.
The really neat thing about Mala Compra is when they did the archaeological dig, normally when the archaeologists come in, they dig, write everything down, cover everything back up and leave. Well, here we have the actual ruins. They're covered. You can walk around, you can see the various parts of the houses, the wells, and there's interpretive signs all along.
The site is well, for a number of years there was a trailer park there. And the county bought Bing's Landing, and then they discovered the site, and they've done several archaeological projects there, and they built that roof over. They built a big platform over it, and there's interpretive sites there today. So it's a point of interest. People stop, look, and that's also a busy park. There's a restaurant there and a boat launch, and people come down there to fish. A combination of history and recreation.
The Mala Compra Plantation was destroyed during the Second Seminole War of the 1830s. The same fate was in store for the Bulow Plantation. In 1821, Charles W. Bulow purchased 9,000 acres of land in what is now Flagler County.
The Bulow Plantation was one of the largest plantation enterprises in territorial Florida. It was very successful because its major crop was sugar. And that was sugar was very, very expensive and very prized. And so, remember now, the sugar was also used to make rum. So he's very, very successful. And however, unfortunately, that success suffered the fate of the Seminole Indian Wars because his plantation, like many of the others in Northeast Florida, were burned by the Seminoles. Now, the reason they were burned was not because the Seminoles disliked Mr. Bulow, because actually he got along with them. Mr. Hernandez's plantation burned. He got along with them. They traded with them. The reason why they were burned is that when the federal troops came in to fight the Seminoles, the idea was Andrew Jackson's idea was he wanted to ship them all west, get all the Seminoles out of Florida. Well, they adopted a strategy that wherever the federal troops went to bivouac, to supply depots, their hospitals, whatever it was, they would burn those places so the federal troops couldn't use them again. So unfortunately, the unintended consequences, of that war was a great deal of wealth was lost.
In the Jacksonville area, Anna Kingsley was not only what I would say an overseer. There is information to suggest that she actually owned some enslaved people during her tenure in Jacksonville. So you have a few enslaved people owned by other blacks, but the reason in some cases been that blacks owned other enslaved people was that they could not free them. So in order to protect them, they were listed as slaves on the census records and the tax rolls, but they were really part of the family.
Zephaniah Kingsley and his African wife, Anna Kingsley, and they had a very, I guess you'd say, unconventional relationship in that Zephaniah fully recognized her as his wife and did everything he could to figure out a way, even in the restrictive, awful climate of racial climate and legal climate, which got worse and worse and worse and worse as the decades went forward up to the 1840s and 50s. He did everything he could to ensure their safety and the fact that she would be able to inherit property from what was 3 different plantations in both Duval and Nassau County.
The papers from El Destino Plantation are archived at the Library of Florida History in Cocoa. The papers are being digitized and transcribed for easier access to the public. El Destino was owned by George Noble Jones.
He was an absentee landlord because he had a larger plantation in Savannah. So his plantation, El Destino, was basically run by overseers. And some of them were okay, but the other ones were not. And Jones had really a plantation in Leon County and one in Jefferson County. Overseers running both of those plantations. And as an absentee landlord, he did not know all the inner workings of those 2 plantations in Jefferson County and Leon County. And I've read through his letters, and some of the overseers were very abusive.
Well, El Destino was one of the and Chamonix Plantation, they were kind of together. Those were 2 plantations that were huge, huge operations, and they're probably the largest operations of what was at that time the plantation belt. And of course, these plantations, the locations of these plantations, and the acreage and the amount of enslaved people have all really been documented pretty well.
So I think it's important that we not forget about the antebellum period, because the antebellum period sets up how blacks began to develop or continue to develop their institutions like their churches and their schools. All this started during the institution of slavery, but a lot of it was hidden. But after slavery ended, a lot of these institutions within the black community began to expand. So we need to know about the Grove. We need to know about Goodwood. We need to know about the Bannerman Plantation. We need to know about many of these plantations throughout Middle Florida, because they tell the history of a group of people who helped to make Florida what it is today.
Remnants of Florida's antebellum plantation society can be seen today at Goodwood Museum and Gardens and the Grove Museum in Tallahassee, the Kingsley Plantation on Fort George Island in Duval County, and at Bulow Plantation Ruins Historic State Park in Flagler County. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts.